Hey, welcome to Daily Grace. We're so glad you're with us. This is where we take hold of the grace that God holds out to us each and every day. So as you see, we've got a great treat for us today, a blast from Grace's past, a three-point shooting machine. He was our first fellow, and now he is a filer of Supreme Court briefs. Jake Warner, thank you for being with us. How you doing?
Great. It's great to be back, Jason. So good to see you.
We are so glad you're here. We're tuning in with you. You live now in Phoenix, and you're not the only place in the country with triple-digit temperatures. We are in the middle of a heat wave. All our grass is dying.
I don't wish that on anyone.
But you live it for about 6 months of the year, I feel like.
It's true. It's pretty hot out here. That's one of the most disappointing things about being out west.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Well, okay, listen. Well, so you're out west. How long have you been there? Let's do the family. How long have you been there, and what's going on?
Sure. We moved out here in January of 2017, so it's been a little bit over 3.5 years now.
Wow. And you okay, before going why you moved there, tell us how Ashley is and your children and all that kind of stuff.
Ashley's doing so well. We recently welcomed our third child into the world, little Alethea Jo Warner. She's 5.5 months old, so we were very excited about that. But Ashley's doing well, taking care of her. And, it's been a bit of a different season for all of us the past few months with the virus. But we're doing well as a family, and the kids are getting outside and playing. And, we're weathering this season as well as we can.
No doubt. So Alethea Jo is
That's right.
7.5 months. And then Atticus is how old now?
Atticus just turned 4 years old.
Oh my goodness.
He just had his 4th birthday, and we had a water balloon fight, and he just had a blast.
Oh, that's so great. And then Karis, how old is she?
Karis is 6 years old. She'll be 7 in December, but she is just as full of life as she was when we left Kinston.
Well, and I think they still have the booth at Chick-fil-A ready for her, the Karis booth where she did her best discipleship.
That was one of the things we missed most about leaving, was going around town and Karis interacting with friends and being so well connected in community with everyone.
Oh man, your kids, and I haven't met Alethea, which means truth.
Truth.
I haven't met her yet, but the other two, we just love them, and we miss you guys and love you guys. But we're excited because God took you to Phoenix on purpose. And what was that purpose? And tell us a little bit about your work with ADF.
Sure. Well, God called us to Phoenix to join Alliance Defending Freedom. And you may have heard of ADF before, but to give you a quick snapshot of the ministry, it's an alliance-building legal organization, the largest in the world, dedicated to protecting God-given rights, particularly religious freedom, the sanctity of life, free speech, and marriage and family. All of our work focuses on those 4 issues exclusively. And that mission really excited me, and it's been a joy coming to ADF. I work, or have worked for the past few years, on the conscience team there, in which I get to represent primarily Christian business owners who are facing legal trouble for trying to live out their faith in the marketplace.
And conscience meaning freedom of conscience, like we can really hold views from our hearts convictionally. Is that right?
Sure. That's what the First Amendment is all about. The First Amendment protects our freedom to believe according to our deepest convictions, and also to express those beliefs through our words and through our artistic expression and otherwise. Those things are fundamental constitutional rights in our country, and we're so thankful for them.
Well, tell us about, I know you, I don't know how many other people here at Grace know this, but you worked on a pretty important case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and then I think is still going because of some other stuff, the Masterpiece Cake Baker. Tell us a little bit about that. Both the whole case, but also your experience.
Sure. Well, I can tell you Jack Phillips is a wonderful man. He loves Jesus, he loves the gospel, and he wants to live it out at his workplace. And many folks might remember back in 2012, two men came in Jack's shop and requested a custom wedding cake that would celebrate a same-sex marriage. And that's something that Jack in good conscience just could not create. It was a message he would not express for anyone, so he politely declined. Then a couple of months later, Jack faced some legal trouble for that decision. And throughout that legal journey, Jack faced some pretty harsh criticism, particularly from the state of Colorado. During that litigation, we learned that that Colorado was treating Jack worse than other cake artists. It was letting other cake artists decline to express messages through their custom cakes that went against their conscience, but it would not afford Jack that same freedom, and that was a problem. In addition, some of the decision makers along the way in Jack's case compared his religious beliefs about marriage and his plea for religious freedom to beliefs that justified the Holocaust and slavery. It was some pretty damaging and critical and just flat out wrong comments about Jack's sincere biblical faith. And for those reasons, the case went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And you might remember back in June of 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed the lower court's decision against Jack, saying it's not right for a state to treat Jack worse than other cake artists simply because of his faith. And it also condemned Colorado for criticizing his faith in such a terrible way. They said that that violated Jack's First Amendment rights to freely exercise his faith. And so he won that case.
And so that should be the end of the story, right? And everyone rides off into the sunset with happiness.
You would think so. And certainly that case laid the groundwork for some very fundamental principles to be in place. Most importantly, that case solidified the point that states can't treat Christians worse than others in the marketplace. They can't kick Christian business owners out of the marketplace simply because they dislike their faith. That said, certainly other people with different motives can still harass Jack, and we've seen them. Back on the same day, back in June of 2017, when the U.S. Supreme Court decided to hear Jack's case, a local Denver attorney called Jack's shop and asked for a custom cake, blue on the exterior and pink on the interior, that would celebrate a gender transition. Of course, according to Jack's faith, he doesn't believe that a person's sex can be chosen or that it can be changed. So he politely declined that. That cake would have communicated a message that went against his core beliefs. And that launched a second round of litigation. The state of Colorado came after him again. We filed a federal lawsuit to try to stop that action, and the federal court intervened and denied the state's motion to dismiss. And a couple of months later, when new evidence surfaced of the state's hostility against Jack, apparently there were officials on the Colorado Civil Rights Commission that basically adopted the same comments that the Supreme Court condemned in Jack's first case. They thought that those comments were actually correct and not worthy of being condemned. So when that evidence came to light, the state abandoned their prosecution and offered to settle the case.
Wow.
That said, a few months later, after that case was settled and dismissed, the same attorney filed a private lawsuit against Jack in state court, and we are currently litigating that case. So Jack's not out of the water yet. He still faces a harassing lawsuit from someone who mostly just disagrees with Jack's position on important issues.
That is unbelievable. So 8 years, like 2012, this has been going on, and all he wants to do is serve his community according to his convictions. It's crazy. Jake, I'm no legal scholar, and so I might be way off base, but it was, and you know, I probably shouldn't say this, but when President Trump was elected, and then, you know, always when you get elected, then you have an inauguration, and the idea of all these inaugural balls that people go to and so on, first ladies, it's a very high and honorable thing to be able to design a dress for the first lady for the inauguration. And I know at least one designer said, there's no way I'm ever going to design a dress for Melania Trump. And I just thought, isn't that exactly, like, isn't she just living according to her convictions, and nobody's bothering with that? And they're not even religious convictions, they're just preferences. Like, it's just so weird. So I don't know if that's a real, like, it seemed to work in my mind, but I'm not a legal mind. But it just felt so like, sure, you can do that, but poor old Jack Phillips, the cake baker.
I think that highlights the important fact that we all have important convictions in our lives. They're not all the same convictions, but everyone has a set of core beliefs that's deeply meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
And the same principle that we are advocating for in Jack's case is the same principle that protects those with wholly different views about marriage and sex than what Jack holds. And I think that's the important part about this, is we have people who identify as LGBT who are contacting us and who support Jack, and who have even filed briefs in support of some of our clients, because they recognize if the government has the power to force Jack to express messages that violate his core beliefs, it has the power also to force them to express messages that violate their core beliefs. So this is a principle that really protects everyone, and that's something that I think we should all get behind. Too often when we see court cases in the media, too often we think, well, I agree with that person's position on this important life issue, and then we vote for them to win the case.
Yeah.
But we should pause and say, well, what's the principle underneath this? Because it's not always just who you side with, it's what principle do you want being the one that controls the way we get to live our lives here.
Absolutely. And that's a longer burn. Like it's not an immediate maybe victory, but it's a longer sort of proper foundation. I think that is so true. As you were talking, and to come out of this interview a little bit and go into, shepherding the body at Grace, this is why as believers, we need to know what we believe and really live it, really believe it. Like, we can't just go with the flow. We have to really believe the Bible, or just set it aside. We have to really believe Jesus is the Son of God and our only hope, or else stop playing. Like, this is just, convictions matter, and everybody's going to live by something, and we're all living by something. And anyway, let's live into the end of sermon. Jake, I was just prepping some stuff for a new class coming in of church planter and some others, and I was just thinking back to the very fun times we had in class when you were a fellow, along with several other great luminaries back in the day. And we just miss those times. The great times, just bantering and thinking deeply about what God's doing. Let me shift from oh, by the way, the other thing is Grace Fellowship, actually, I don't know if you know this, Jake, but Grace Fellowship has retained ADF, or in their new thing called the Church Defense Team, or Church Defense Fund, or something.
Yeah, the Church Alliance.
Church Alliance. And so what ADF is offering to churches across the country is a partnership for a really, really low level, but to help us make sure our building usage and HR guidelines and membership policies and bylaws are all in line with, in case anything should ever happen down the road in a First Amendment case, they've already looked at our bylaws and our stuff. And Jake, please pass along to the gang there. We're so thankful for what y'all have already done with us, and we're pleased to be on the team.
Certainly, it's really a big treat for ADF to get to serve churches just like Grace across the nation, making sure that documents are in order and that they are as fully protected as possible for when threats come.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, Jake, let's talk Supreme Court, because you were there. You were on the Masterpiece. I kind of feel like you might have been like Tom Cruise in A Few Good Men, jumping around, but you actually were sitting there. You weren't arguing the case, although I would have.
No, I was not arguing the case. I was just observing.
You were observing, but you can't handle the truth, which I think happens in every courtroom. I'm sure it never does. Anyway, so the Supreme Court, in any given term, because I think they just finished the term, How many cases are they looking at anyway? Like, I kind of lose track of all this kind of stuff, and I need a little primer on the civics lesson because I grew up in Canada, and our Supreme Court is different.
Well, the Supreme Court is really fascinating, right? It's the highest court in the land. Cases reach the U.S. Supreme Court typically from the U.S. Court of Appeals or from the highest state court, typically a state Supreme Court. And most cases at the U.S. Supreme Court involve an issue of federal law or constitutional law. The U.S. Supreme Court receives approximately 7,000 to 8,000 petitions every year.
Wow.
And in most cases, the U.S. Supreme Court is not required to review the case. It's something that they have the option of doing if they want to, but they're not required to. And of those 7,000 or 8,000 petitions that they receive, they typically only accept about 70 or 80 petitions for argument each term. So you're looking at a rate of a little bit over 1% of cases in which the U.S. Supreme Court is asked to weigh in. That's about the number that they actually do weigh in on.
Wow. This term just ended. Let's talk about some of the interesting cases that came down. I mean, we can't talk about all 80 of them. And of course, you probably don't even know them all, even as smart as you are. But there's some that kind of affect First Amendment stuff, which is what you do. Tell me some of the interesting ones. Maybe
Sure.
positive and maybe negative.
Yeah, just in the past month, we got some big First Amendment wins on free exercise grounds. And a couple of those cases are...
Does that mean gyms can open free exercise?
Well, that's a different topic. We might get to some COVID cases soon. But you might have heard of the case titled Espinoza. It was a case involving what's called a Blaine Amendment. That probably doesn't make a lot of sense to the viewers, but a Blaine Amendment was something that was popular back in the late 1800s. A U.S. congressperson named James G. Blaine introduced an amendment that basically said that there can be no aid to religious organizations or religious schools in particular. It never got traction at the federal or nationwide level, but many states in the late 1800s adopted these so-called Blaine Amendments. And really the whole purpose of these amendments was not very good because they were enacted with really hostility towards those with Catholic views. It was a very anti-Catholic initiative that was going on in the late 1800s. So in more recent years, hopefully we've moved away from many of those anti-Catholic sentiments, and many of those Blaine Amendments are starting to be challenged more heavily. And in this Espinoza case, the U.S. Supreme Court basically said that the state can't use this no aid provision to discriminate against religious schools. If the state offers some kind of private or some kind of funding to be used in private schools, they have to allow that funding to be used on an equal basis at religious schools. So that was an important development, saying states, you really can't discriminate against religious schools solely because of their status as religious schools. And we have a case that's somewhat similar to that going on in Vermont, and I'm about to brief the case here in the next week or two. It's a case involving a dual enrollment program up in Vermont. Essentially, the state offers to pay for high school students to dual enroll in 2 college courses. But in certain areas of the state, the only students who are excluded from that program are students in religious schools. And that's not fair, and we think that that violates the principle recently established in the Espinoza case. Another case I'll highlight quickly is one called Our Lady of Guadalupe. It was a case involving what legal folks dubbed the ministerial exception. This was something that has been around for years in common law dating back to England and different places. But more recently, the U.S. Supreme Court recognized that in a case called Hosanna Tabor. But there were still some questions about this ministerial exception, which applies to churches and religious organizations. Essentially, the rule says that those places get to control who their ministers are. The government has no business telling a church or a religious organization who is qualified to be one of their ministers. But for the past few years, there's been a bit of an open question. How do you really define what a minister is? And the U.S. Supreme Court gave some clarity to that question this past month. And they said that basically you look at the function that the employee serves to determine whether that person is a minister. And we give great deference to the church or religious organization in that analysis. So those are two big free exercise wins that we saw just in the past month or so.
That's great. I mean, sometimes all you kind of hear is the negative news, and those are really important things. And actually, especially for the Blaine, age of religious schools, that's going to help a lot of kids, a lot of families, in a great way across the country. How about some bad news? Any bad news coming out of Washington ever?
Well, sure. There's always a bit of difficulty too. And one just as recently as the past week or two, we've been representing a church out in Nevada. There's lots of COVID restrictions that are being enacted across the country, and certainly the government has a heightened interest in this season when there's a pandemic. But that said, the government doesn't have the right to unreasonably discriminate against churches and religious individuals, and we see that happening in Nevada. There, the governor opened casinos